All right, everyone, welcome back to another GME video. Just want to point out that if you missed the 3 videos before this, you might have a hard time keeping up with all of it, and it may not make so much sense. So if you are struggling to understand some of the concepts discussed in this video, I would highly recommend that you just go to my YouTube channel, watch the past 3 GME videos in order that I made over the past week, and this video should make a lot more sense to you. So one thing I just want to talk about before we jump into the charts is that this isn't, from a technical perspective, but just from a been in this saga long enough perspective. I do think that, Roaring Kitty making a reappearance kind of signifies the beginning to the end. I do think this process is going to take a little longer than many people expect based on sentiment that I've received from Twitter over the past couple of weeks. But nonetheless, I do think his reappearance is the beginning to an end. And in this video, I will demonstrate what we would like to see happen to confirm this theory and what we would like to see occur to confirm the bullishness of GME, how far we can expect the rally to happen, how long will it take, etc., and confirmations and invalidations. So let's get started. To start, it's very important to look at GME's previous monthly trigger breakout. As you can see here, GME broke above the monthly trigger twice in its lifetime. One was here when price was 570, and GME moved 200% up over the course of, I think it's, let's just get the exact date range. So here was the breakout. So in about a little over a year, GME was able to double in price. Now, this was significantly less shorted over this time period where GME broke below the monthly trigger, which caused monthly velocity to flip negative. During this whole time, while monthly velocity was negative, GME got slammed to the downside. And then there was a period here from about August 2019 where monthly velocity started to slowly but surely turn less and less negative until, with the breakout above the monthly trigger, velocity was actually able to turn positive. And just keep in mind that velocity turned positive for 1 month, November, and grew stronger in December, grew stronger in January, and then, grew incredibly strong when GME started to really lift. Now, another important thing to note is that price breaking above the monthly trigger is only one key factor. You'll notice that as soon as the daily trigger, this blue line right here, was able to cross above the monthly trigger, it ignited further upside for GME. And you'll notice that once the weekly trigger crossed above the monthly trigger, that's what ignited the real upside move for GME. And from the breaking point where price broke above the monthly trigger back in September 2020, it took about 77 days, so almost 3 months, for the weekly trigger to climb, and cross above the monthly trigger. So the reason why I'm bringing this to your attention is to explain that before GME sees a really strong rise in price, more than likely it's going to have to remain above the monthly trigger long enough to confirm the breakout. And confirming the breakout means that the daily trigger has to cross above the monthly trigger and the weekly trigger has to cross above the monthly trigger. That's when we can expect things to get wild. Right now, GME is in the very early stages of breaking above the monthly trigger. I don't want to compare it to this setup at all because the setup is totally different, but for imagination's sake, break out above the monthly trigger, and it already got the pullback to the monthly trigger and closed the week above it, which was really nice to see. So moving back to a little bit more current time, we had kind of a repeat of what we saw in previous years for GME, back from 2013 to 2020, where price broke below the monthly trigger, generated that nasty negative monthly velocity, and just got crushed in price. We had the same thing starting in about, looks like it was here, September of 2022, where GME broke below the monthly trigger, started generating negative monthly velocity, and it's just been an ugly ride. Price went from 30 all the way to a low of about 990 or whatever it was. Then, kind of out of the blue, GME exploded to the upside, broke above the monthly trigger, and because monthly velocity was negative, this is very important, price was pulled all the way back down to the monthly trigger. So getting above the monthly trigger definitely did cause very strong acceleration, like we predicted in the previous two videos. But because monthly velocity was so strong, it pulled price all the way back down to the monthly trigger. Now, I think the single most significant event that happened in this past week was weekly velocity flipping from negative to positive, and a strong positive print at that. So you'll notice here, before monthly velocity turned positive, first price broke above the weekly trigger right here. And in breaking above the weekly trigger, you could see weekly velocity started to rise for about 4 or 5 weeks. And then monthly velocity right here was able to slowly turn positive. It takes weekly velocity turning positive in order for monthly velocity to turn positive. So the lower time frame velocities will influence the higher time frame velocities. And because GME was able to break above the weekly trigger right here, which is this thick blue line, and generate this positive weekly velocity as shown in the green bars, eventually it was able to turn monthly velocity, the orange bars, positive. So coming back to where we are now, we're seeing a very similar phenomenon where although monthly velocity is still negative, weekly velocity flipped positive 2 weeks ago and closed even stronger positive the previous week. And so with strong pumping weekly velocity, if GME can get a couple of more weeks of this, today's date is May 19th. The month will end in about 10 days or so. And when that happens, we'll get a new monthly velocity print. If GME can remain above the monthly trigger, which is currently at 2052, for just another 10 to 12 days, the next monthly velocity print will no longer be negative. And when monthly velocity goes from negative to positive after a long period of time being negative, like we saw here, where monthly velocity was negative for the longest time, in fact, over 5 years, and then finally flipped positive, it only took 3 months of positive monthly velocity before price exploded into triple digits from, just $2 at the time, or it was 8 back then. Now we're seeing, again, a very similar phenomenon where monthly velocity is strongly negative, which unfortunately brought price all the way back down to the monthly trigger. But now we're starting to see weekly velocity turn positive, a very strong print. So what do we want to see next here is very simple. Zoom in a bit. All we want to see is the daily trigger and the weekly trigger cross above the monthly trigger. And for that to happen, the daily trigger, the further price is above the daily trigger, the faster the daily trigger will climb. The further price is above the weekly trigger, the faster the weekly trigger will climb. So yes, we want to see price go up, but not for the sake of seeing our portfolios gain in value. We want to see price rise so that the daily trigger can get that all-important cross above the monthly trigger. And if it does, just like we saw back in 2021, that's when we'll start to see even more acceleration as GME slowly confirms the breakout above the monthly trigger. So just like here, where price breaking above the monthly trigger caused a little bit of acceleration, but then price pulled back. And once the daily trigger was able to cross above, started getting a little more spicy, and the upside started to be a little more violent, and the daily trigger was able to provide support on pullbacks. And because the daily trigger crossed above the monthly trigger and caused this upside acceleration, and price was able to drift far above the weekly trigger, that helped the weekly trigger climb and climb and climb until it was able to cross above the monthly trigger, which ignited the really strong upside breakout. So we want to see the same thing here. We want to see price slowly continue to climb, not for price itself to get higher, but so that the daily trigger can cross above the monthly trigger, ignite another pop higher, and then that second pop higher will allow the weekly trigger over the next month or two to be able to climb above the monthly trigger. Now, if price goes vertical, if price gets back to like the 80 range, it'll only take 2 or 3 weeks for the weekly trigger to cross above the monthly trigger. If price continues to drift in this $20, $30, $40 range, it can take 2-3 months. So last week, the weekly trigger was able to jump from 1454 to 1517. So not a crazy jump, but if GME, and the reason why it only jumped that much is actually because price pulled all the way back to 20. So you'll notice how the algorithms work. They don't care where price goes in middle of the week. It's all about where price closes the end of the week, actually. Very important to understand that. So again, because if GME would have been able to close the week up at 80 or up at 60 or 70, then things would have been a lot better of a bullish setup going into next week. But because unfortunately GME closed all the way back at 20, the weekly trigger was only able to rise $1. So if GME can put in a strong bullish week coming up, then we would be able to expect the weekly trigger to continue rising higher and higher, getting closer to cross above the monthly trigger. So in terms of short-term price action, while price is below the hourly trigger, which is this green line here, we can't really expect upside, but if price can get above the hourly trigger, that will reignite the upside spark. So here's where price broke above the hourly trigger last time, and as long as price was riding the hourly trigger, the hourly is going to say bullish or strong bullish here, which leads to upside. Now the hourly trigger is weak bearish. We want to see it turn bullish again with a break above the hourly trigger. Now, in terms of levels to watch on your screen, we have some fib alerts from Gavin, who gave the bottom level on Friday, which was 2023. And there's a lot of room from 2023 to 2965. So if you are a new trader looking at this setup, the Elliot wave forecast for this type of move is a really strong upside continuation for price. So we have the wave 1 starting from the bottom till the top of 80, and all of this looks like a wave 2 pullback followed by a wave 3 targeting anywhere of these yellow lines. So think about it like this: we can't know exactly where it will top, but target between these lines. And again, Elliott wave is not time constrained, so don't think that this means GME is expected to move up here by June 13th. It's just giving a visual representation of how price may react over the coming months. This is not meant to track time. And then finally a wave 4 pullback followed by a wave 5 top. Now, although we can't say how long this will last, what we could say is that as long as this low of 2023 remains the bottom, this setup remains valid. A break below 2023 and all these targets will slowly move down. We'll move down a little bit to match price. So these targets are based off the low being at 2023. If GME comes back down to fill this gap all the way to 1793, then the targets will just adjust downwards by $3. So based on this, as a new trader coming into the trade, it does look like a fantastic trade from a risk to reward perspective, with a stop loss on a close below the daily trigger right here, which is currently at 1955. So if there's a daily close below the daily trigger, that can be a valid stop loss. But as long as 2023, or as long as the daily trigger continues to hold support, price is expected to move much higher to complete this wave 3 over the coming months. And so this makes a great risk reward setup with only $1 or $2 of downside risk compared to about $100 of upside possible reward. Now, all I, as a GME investor, would want to see over the coming weeks and months is price remaining above 2023, hopefully pushing up to the 2965 level next, or even 3704, because the faster price pushes up here, the faster the daily trigger can cross above the monthly trigger, which will spark the next leg of upside acceleration, which will allow the weekly trigger to cross above the monthly trigger. And like I showed in previous videos, once the triggers are in the most bullish trigger orientation, which is the hourly above the daily, above the weekly, above the monthly trigger, meaning the daily trigger and the weekly trigger need to get above this monthly trigger, then that'll put the stock in the most bullish trigger orientation. And when stocks are in their most bullish trigger orientations, well, we'll look at NVIDIA here and a couple of other examples. Stocks are able to go on spectacular bull runs over the course of many months, or even years, or even 5 years, once the triggers are in the most bullish trigger orientation. So that means the monthly needs to be strong bullish and the weekly needs to be strong bullish. So you can see NVIDIA here, a very similar example and a setup that we might see. We had a test of the monthly trigger that was rejected, and then price was able to get above the monthly trigger, get its daily trigger above the monthly trigger, and get its weekly trigger above the monthly trigger, which sparked a multi-year bull run. Now you'll see something very similar in Bitcoin, for example, where Bitcoin was trying to break above its monthly trigger for about a month or two, and then when it was finally able to get that breakout, it was able to explode to the upside and go on a fantastic bull run that is very likely still in process. So you'll see here with Bitcoin, I'm just going to go to the 1-day time frame. A little bit of a lag here, but this is the last part of the video regardless. So we'll wrap it up right after this. And there, of course, there's hundreds of more examples. I can show you SPY, which was the exact same setup, QQQ, AMD, a bunch of other bullish stocks. But here you can see Bitcoin trying to break above its monthly trigger for a while, finally gets above the monthly trigger and gets that initial upside acceleration. And then once the daily trigger and the weekly trigger cross above, and the monthly trigger and the weekly trigger, and now all triggers are all long, price was able to more than double in price and just go on a really strong bull run where dips are bought quickly and upside is violent. I'll show you one more example with, we could do SPY or QQQ, I think is a slightly better example, where you'll see the exact same phenomenon where once the triggers get into the bullish trigger orientation, which is the daily on top of the weekly on top of the monthly, price is able to move spectacularly to the upside with, again, dips being bought quickly and upside lasting very strong. So we'll take one final look at QQQ. Tried to break above its monthly trigger here, but monthly velocity was still negative, as you can see. So the monthly trigger held resistance, but then the weekly velocity started to turn bullish. The monthly velocity slowly picked up to the upside, and before you knew it, QQQ went from 304 all the way to 455 for a spectacular gain. And you'll notice that all these dips found support at the weekly trigger or found support at the monthly velocity, continued higher, another dip down, but the weekly trigger provided support to push it higher. And if Jamie can get into the most bullish trigger orientation, that's what we'll expect for the next year or so, or even possibly much longer than a year, where upside will be fast and violent and dips will just pull back to triggers before the algos step in to buy and continue to push it higher. So this video was helpful for you. I know it's quite long, but would definitely appreciate if you guys could like it and share it with friends, and I'll be in touch for the next one.